Luca Valenti had broken his executive chef's nose. The crack echoed through the grand kitchen, louder than the clatter of pans. Silence followed. Then came the words that froze every employee in the Valenti Crown Hotel. "You're fired." Before anyone could breathe, Luca pointed toward the dining room. "Everyone who thinks this place cannot function without any of you may leave. Every single one of you." 300 termination notices were already waiting inside leather folders. 300 careers erased in less than a minute. Nobody argued, nobody begged, nobody cried. Instead, Daniel Cho slowly unclipped his management badge and placed it on the marble counter. The sound of plastic touching stone seemed impossibly loud. One housekeeping supervisor followed, then another. Bell captains, front desk managers, restaurant supervisors, laundry coordinators, banquet leaders, security officers. Within moments, badges covered the counter like fallen dominoes. Without exchanging a word, hundreds of employees quietly walked toward the lobby doors. Not one of them looked back. For the first time in years, Luca felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, confusion. His empire had survived lawsuits, hostile competitors, and even organized crime investigations. Yet a hotel full of ordinary employees had chosen unemployment instead of another day under his leadership. He reached for another stack of termination letters. If anyone else wants to join them. A hand caught the papers. Not aggressively, firmly. Luca looked up. Standing between him and the remaining employees was a woman he had never seen before. She wore a navy blazer over a simple white blouse. Her confidence filled the room more completely than any expensive suit ever could. She wasn't conventionally thin. She wasn't trying to be. She stood comfortably inside her own skin, her posture relaxed, her expression almost curious, as though she had interrupted nothing more serious than an awkward meeting. Without asking permission, she took the termination letters from Luca's hand. Then, she calmly tore them in half. The ripping paper echoed through the silent lobby. Several employees gasped. Even Daniel Cho stared. Nobody treated Luca Valenti this way. Luca's voice became dangerously quiet. "Do you know who I am?" The woman smiled politely. "Yes." "And you still destroyed my documents?" They were already destroying themselves. Luca stepped closer. "You've just ended your career. I don't work for you." That answer stopped him for half a second. She extended a business card. Maya Ellis, founder, Common Ground Resolution, Corporate Leadership and Labor Mediation. "I was invited by your sister," she said. "Sophia believes your company has a leadership problem." Luca almost laughed. "My company has an obedience problem." Maya glanced toward the nearly empty lobby. "It appears your employees disagree. They're replaceable. So was your executive chef?" He struck first. Leo Bennett, holding a towel against his bleeding nose, raised one eyebrow. "I dropped a plate." Maya looked back at Luca. "You broke his nose over broken porcelain?" "It wasn't about the plate." "I know." She folded her arms. "It never is." Luca hated that answer because it sounded true. He had spent years convincing himself. Discipline required absolute control. Weakness spread. Exceptions multiplied. Fear kept standards high, didn't it? Maya slowly turned toward the remaining staff. "Anyone here still afraid to speak?" Nobody answered. She nodded. "Exactly." Then she faced Luca again. "They aren't afraid of losing their jobs." She gestured toward the employees who had just walked away. "They were waiting for permission to lose you." The sentence landed harder than any punch. For the first time in decades, Luca had no immediate response. Before he could recover, Sofia Valenti hurried into the lobby, breathless after hearing what had happened. She looked around the deserted hotel and covered her mouth. "No." Daniel quietly approached her. "I'm sorry." Sophia's eyes filled with tears. "They actually left?" Daniel nodded. They finally believed nothing would ever change. She turned toward her brother. "Luca." Instead of defending himself, he simply asked, "When will replacements arrive?" Daniel answered before anyone else could. "They won't. They'll come for higher salaries. They already refused. They didn't refuse the money. They refused you." The words irritated Luca far more than he wanted to admit. He had increased wages twice in 3 years. He offered bonuses, luxury staff meals, health benefits, performance incentives. None of it mattered. Why? Maya seemed to reread his thoughts. "You think compensation creates loyalty?" "It helps. It helps people stay." She paused. "It doesn't make them want to." Luca folded his arms. "So what's your solution?" "I'll tell you tomorrow morning." He frowned. "Tomorrow?" 6 o'clock. I don't attend meetings at 6. She smiled. "It isn't a meeting." She handed him a neatly folded housekeeping uniform. "You'll be cleaning rooms." Luca stared at the uniform as though it were a joke. "I own this hotel." "Exactly. You expect me to make beds?" "I expect you to understand the people who do." He looked at Sophia. "This is absurd." His sister quietly replied, "So is losing 300 employees before lunch." Maya turned toward the exit. "Oh, one more thing." She looked back with the same calm expression she had worn all morning. "Tomorrow nobody will know you're the owner. They'll only know whether you're good at your job." For the first time in years, Luca Valenti wasn't certain he would be. At precisely 6 o'clock the next morning, Luca Valenti stood outside the housekeeping office wearing a uniform that fit him poorly. Nobody greeted him with fear. Nobody rushed to impress him. In fact, nobody recognized him. Rosa Martinez glanced at the clipboard in her hands. "You must be the temporary worker." Luca almost corrected her. Instead, he simply nodded. Rosa handed him a cart overflowing with towels, sheets, toiletries, cleaning supplies, and enough equipment to feel heavier than it looked. 28 rooms. Luca frowned. "Before lunch?" Rosa blinked. "Before 11. He stared at her. She wasn't joking. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead. Room 401 took him almost 40 minutes. The bed looked acceptable until Rosa quietly pulled back the blanket. The corners were uneven. The pillows faced opposite directions. Dust still covered the television cabinet. The bathroom mirror carried streaks. The shampoo bottles weren't facing forward. "The guest notices all of this?" Luca asked. Rosa answered without emotion. "The guest notices when we don't." By the 4th room, sweat soaked through his uniform. By the 6th, his back ached. By the 8th, he had stopped checking the time because it only made him feel slower. Meanwhile, Rosa continued preparing rooms with effortless rhythm. Every towel landed perfectly. Every sheet stretched tight enough to bounce a coin. Every room finished in barely 12 minutes. Luca finally asked, "How long have you done this?" 34 years. He stopped pushing his cart. 34. She nodded. "I started when your mother did." Luca looked at her. "My mother worked here?" "Not here. Different hotel. But the same work." She continued folding towels. 12-hour shifts. Sometimes 14. Luca remained silent. He knew his mother had worked in hospitality before he became successful. He knew she had struggled. But he had never asked what her days actually looked like. He had only remembered the smile she wore when he came home from school. He had never wondered how tired she must have been before she smiled. By 10 o'clock, Luca had discovered something unexpected. Housekeeping wasn't simply cleaning. It was solving problems before anyone else noticed them. One room needed extra pillows because of a medical condition. Another required fragrance-free products. One guest had forgotten medication inside a refrigerator. Another cried quietly after receiving bad news over the phone. Every room carried a story. Every guest arrived carrying invisible burdens. Housekeeping entered those stories without ever becoming part of them. Nobody applauded. Nobody thanked them. Yet everything depended on them. Meanwhile, across the hallway, Maya watched from a discreet distance, not interfering, simply observing. She carried a small notebook. Every time Luca learned something without complaining, she wrote it down. Every time he almost exploded, but controlled himself. She smiled. Around noon, she approached him. How many rooms? 12. She looked at the schedule. You've completed less than half. This workload is unreasonable, Rosa overheard him. No, she gently corrected. You've simply never respected how long excellence takes. Luca wanted to argue. He couldn't. Just after lunch came the assignment everyone secretly anticipated. Decorative towel folding. A luxury suite expected swan-shaped towels for honeymoon guests. Rosa demonstrated once. Elegant, simple, beautiful. Luca nodded confidently. I understand. 20 minutes later, his creation looked less like a graceful swan and far more like a chicken that had lost a fight with a lawn-mower. One wing pointed upward, the neck bent backward, the head collapsed entirely. Maya stared at the towel sculpture for 3 long seconds. Then she quietly pulled out her phone. Click. Luca looked up. Did you just take a picture? I did. Delete it. I don't think I will. Why? Because someday you'll need evidence that perfection isn't your natural state. He sighed. I hate that joke. I know. That's why it's funny. Even Rosa laughed. The sound surprised everyone. Employees rarely laughed around Luca, not because they lacked humor, because they had never felt safe enough to use it. For the first time, the hallway sounded less like a workplace, and more like people working together. Near the end of the shift, an elderly guest approached Luca. Excuse me. He turned. My husband has dementia. He keeps forgetting which room is ours. I know you're busy, but could you help him without embarrassing him? Luca instinctively looked around for another employee. Nobody came. The responsibility belonged to him. He walked beside the elderly man instead. They spoke about baseball, old movies, Italian food. Nothing about memory loss. When they reached the correct room, the man smiled proudly. I found it. Luca smiled back. You certainly did. The elderly woman whispered quietly, Thank you for protecting his dignity. She closed the door. Luca stood motionless in the hallway, protecting dignity, not solving a problem, not enforcing rules, simply protecting someone's dignity. For reasons he couldn't explain. Those words followed him long after his shift ended. That evening, Maya met him outside the employee entrance. You survived. Barely. So, she folded her arms. Can anyone do housekeeping? Luca looked down at his sore hands, the calluses, the bruises, the cleaning chemicals still lingering on his skin. Then he remembered Rosa's calm efficiency, the exhausted smile of the elderly wife, his mother's invisible sacrifices. Finally, he answered honestly. No, Maya smiled. Excellent. Tomorrow, she handed him a different uniform. You're serving tables. Luca examined the black waiter jacket. He frowned. Surely waiting tables is easier. Maya's smile widened. That's exactly what today's Luca would say. She turned and walked away. Luca watched her leave, for the first time in years. He wasn't worried about running $1 billion empire. He was worried about carrying a tray without dropping it. The next morning, Luca Valenti walked into the hotel's main restaurant, wearing a perfectly pressed waiter uniform. He expected carrying plates to be easier than making beds. He was wrong before breakfast even began. Table 12 needs oat milk. Table 6 has a gluten allergy. Room service forgot the coffee. The conference guests are arriving early. Orders flew across the dining room faster than he could remember them. A senior waitress named Emily handed him a tray. Smile. Luca frowned. I am. Emily stared at him. No, that's your serious face. I don't have another one. We're going to fix that. 30 minutes later, Luca nearly collided with a guest while balancing 4 plates. The tray tilted. Soup splashed onto his sleeve. A businessman sighed dramatically. Incompetent. Luca felt the familiar surge of anger rising inside him. For years, one glare from him had been enough to silence an entire room. Now, he wasn't the owner. He was simply another waiter. Before he could answer, Emily stepped beside him. I apologize, sir. We'll replace your meal immediately. The guest walked away without another word. Luca clenched his jaw. He insulted me. Emily shrugged. He insulted the uniform. There's a difference. Luca wasn't convinced. Just before lunch, a family with a little girl sat near the windows. She couldn't have been older than 6. Bright eyes, curly hair, an endless supply of questions. Luca poured water into their glasses. She studied him carefully, then asked, Mister, why do you always look angry? Her parents immediately apologized. I'm so sorry. She asks everyone everything. Luca looked down at the child. I'm not angry. She tilted her head. Then your face forgot. For 3 seconds, the restaurant became perfectly silent. Emily bit her lip. Daniel Cho turned away. Even the chefs stopped listening through the kitchen window. Then, Maya burst into laughter. Not polite laughter. Real laughter. The kind that arrived unexpectedly and refused to leave. Soon Emily laughed too. Then the little girl's parents, even several nearby guests, smiled. Luca stood there, defeated by a 6-year-old. Finally, he sighed. Perhaps my face has developed bad habits. The little girl nodded seriously. You should practice smiling. It scares people less. When she returned to coloring her menu, Luca found himself smiling without thinking. Emily noticed immediately. There. What? That one? What one? The smile. You finally look human. The afternoon became easier, not because the work changed, because Luca did. He stopped treating every request like an interruption. Instead, he began asking questions. What would you recommend? Is there anything else I can bring you? Did everything taste the way you hoped? Guests responded differently. Some smiled, some relaxed, some thanked him. He had spent years believing hospitality meant efficiency. Now he realized people remembered how they felt long after they forgot what they ordered. That evening, Maya found him sitting alone in the employee cafeteria. His shoulders looked heavier than usual. She sat across from him. No lecture today? I don't think you need one. He looked at her. You planned this. The rotations. Everything. I planned opportunities. You created the lessons. Luca stared at the untouched coffee in front of him. I've spent 20 years believing people respected me. They feared disappointing you. That's not the same thing. He nodded slowly. I know. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Luca broke the silence. Have dinner with me tonight. Maya raised one eyebrow. He continued. I'll reserve the best restaurant in the city. I'll have my driver. She gently lifted one hand. No. He frowned. No. You just turned an invitation into an instruction. I was trying to be generous. I know. But generosity isn't the same as respect. Luca leaned back. So what should I have said? She smiled. I'm not telling you. Why? Because then you'd repeat the words without understanding them. Over the next several days, Luca continued rotating through different departments: laundry, bell service, room service, kitchen preparation. Every position demanded skills he had never noticed before. Each evening he found himself thinking less about profits and more about people. He began greeting employees by name. He thanked dishwashers. He carried luggage without being asked. Some workers remained cautious. Others looked genuinely confused. Was this temporary? Or was the impossible actually happening? One afternoon, Rosa quietly approached him while he organized banquet supplies. I've been waiting. For what? For you to stop defending yourself. She handed him an old photograph. Two women stood together wearing housekeeping uniforms. One of them was unmistakably his mother, young, smiling, exhausted. Beautiful. Rosa touched the edge of the picture. Your mother cried almost every night. Luca looked up sharply. Because the work was too hard. Rosa slowly shook her head. No. Because the guests insulted her. They treated her like she didn't exist. And management? She paused. Never defended her. Luca felt the air leave his lungs. I built hotels because of her. I wanted her sacrifices to matter. Rosa nodded sadly. They did. But somewhere along the way, you became the kind of owner she prayed she'd never have again. She quietly walked away. Luca remained standing alone in the empty banquet hall. For years, he had believed he was honoring his mother's memory. Instead, he had unknowingly recreated the very pain she had endured. For the first time since becoming one of America's most feared men, Luca Valenti closed the door behind him and cried where no one could see him. By the 8th day of the mediation, the Valenti Crown Hotel no longer felt like a company preparing for collapse. It felt like a company holding its breath. Nearly half of the original employees had quietly returned, not because contracts had improved, not because salaries had increased, because they were watching whether Luca Valenti had truly changed, or whether he was simply performing long enough to survive the upcoming international conference. Nobody said it aloud, but everyone was waiting for him to fail. At 7:30 Monday morning, the executive conference room filled with department managers, housekeeping, food and beverage, security, maintenance, front desk, events, banquet services. For years, these meetings had followed the same script. Luca spoke. Everyone else nodded. The meeting ended. Today, something felt different. Sophia projected the staffing schedule onto the screen. Silence spread across the room. The banquet department was missing 12 certified employees. The conference required full staffing in less than 48 hours. Daniel cleared his throat. We cannot legally schedule the current team for another 16-hour shift. Luca studied the schedule. Then redistribute them. Sophia answered immediately. There is nobody left to redistribute. The overnight team already worked yesterday. The restaurant staff are covering room service. The maintenance crew is helping set up banquet halls. We're out of people. Luca felt the familiar pressure building inside his chest. The old instinct whispered the same solution it always had. Order overtime. Threaten consequences. Demand results. His fingers tightened against the conference table. Everyone noticed. Across the room, 30 department managers exchanged nervous glances. Emily quietly removed her employee badge. Daniel noticed. Without speaking, he unclipped his own, one after another. Badges began coming off again. Not dramatically, not angrily. Simply prepared. Prepared to leave if history repeated itself. Sophia saw it happening. Her heart sank. Not again. Please. Not again. Luca slowly looked around the room. Nobody appeared defiant. Nobody looked hateful. They looked tired. Exhausted people preparing themselves for another impossible demand. He remembered Rosa's photograph, his mother's tears, the elderly woman thanking him for protecting her husband's dignity, the little girl asking why his face always looked angry. He suddenly realized something terrifying. For years, every difficult conversation inside this company had begun with fear. If he exploded now, everything they had rebuilt would disappear in seconds. The room became so quiet that the air conditioning sounded deafening. Everyone waited. Luca opened his mouth. The old Luca would have shouted. The new Luca took a slow breath instead. Then he asked 5 words. Nobody in the room had ever heard from him. How would you solve it? Nobody answered. Not because they didn't know. Because they thought they had misheard him. Luca repeated the question, more gently this time. I'm asking, what am I not seeing? Silence lingered. Finally, Daniel cautiously spoke. We split the conference into staggered service windows. Emily added, the breakfast buffet doesn't need full staffing after 9:30. The maintenance director continued. My crew can handle banquet furniture overnight instead of during the day. The executive chef leaned forward. We simplify the menu. Fewer choices, higher quality, less pressure. Housekeeping suggested rotating inspection teams instead of assigning permanent supervisors. Security proposed redirecting traffic through a secondary entrance. Within 15 minutes, the impossible schedule became possible. Nobody had worked longer hours. Nobody had been threatened. Nobody had been humiliated. The solution had already existed. It simply required someone willing to listen. When the meeting ended, no one rushed toward the exit. Instead, several managers remained behind, not because they had to, because they wanted to continue improving the plan. Sophia quietly watched her brother. You didn't give a single order. Luca looked around the room. They didn't need one. She smiled. No, they needed permission to help. That afternoon, Maya found Luca standing alone inside the grand ballroom where the international conference would begin in 2 days. Hundreds of chairs stood perfectly aligned. The stage lights were being tested. Workers adjusted table settings with practiced precision. Luca watched them in silence. They're remarkable, he said. They always were. I never noticed. Maya walked beside him. You noticed. You simply measured the wrong things. He nodded. I counted mistakes. You counted costs. You counted speed. She paused. But you never counted trust. Luca looked across the ballroom. I thought leadership meant having all the answers. And now? I think leadership begins the moment you admit you don't. Maya smiled without saying anything. As they prepared to leave, Luca stopped walking. Maya. She turned. He hesitated. The hesitation itself surprised him. months ago. He would never have paused before asking for what he wanted. Now, he carefully chose every word. I was wondering, she waited patiently, when all of this is over, would you... He stopped again. She could see him fighting the habits of a lifetime. Finally, he smiled awkwardly. Never mind. Maya laughed softly. No. You've earned the right to finish the sentence. Luca looked directly into her eyes. Would you like to have dinner with me? After the mediation is officially complete. No business, no negotiations, no expectations, just dinner. Maya held his gaze for several long seconds. Then she smiled. That's much better. But my answer is still... She paused deliberately. Almost. Luca blinked. Almost? I don't date clients. The mediation ends after the conference. If you still want to ask, then I'll listen. She walked away before he could answer. Luca remained standing in the empty ballroom for the first time in years. Waiting no longer felt like weakness. It felt like respect. And somehow, that made him more nervous than facing any rival he had ever defeated. Conference day arrived before sunrise. For the first time in the hotel's history, every department gathered together before the doors opened. Housekeepers stood beside executives. Dishwashers chatted with accountants. Bellmen joked with security officers. Nobody had been ordered to attend. They simply wanted to be there. Luca looked across the room. 8 days earlier, most of these people had walked away from him. Today, they had chosen to return. Not because they feared him, because they believed in each other. He stepped toward the center of the room. The employees instinctively became quiet. Months ago, silence had meant fear. Today, attention. Luca took a slow breath. I've spent years asking one question. Who made the mistake? He looked around the room. I should have been asking another. What do you need to succeed? No dramatic speech followed. No promises, no excuses. Just 4 simple words. Thank you for returning. Several employees exchanged surprised glances. For many of them, it was the first time they had ever heard those words from their employer. The conference began exactly at 9 o'clock. Hundreds of international executives entered the grand ballroom. Registration flowed smoothly. The restaurant remained ahead of schedule. Housekeeping turned over rooms faster than projected. The simplified banquet menu received glowing compliments. Every department moved with quiet confidence. Not because everything went perfectly, because people trusted one another enough to solve problems together. Luca didn't spend the morning inside the executive lounge. Instead, he carried luggage, delivered water, cleared tables, answered guest questions. No cameras, no publicity. Just work. Maya noticed. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Shortly after lunch, the moment everyone feared finally arrived. A wealthy international investor stormed into the VIP dining room. His voice echoed across the restaurant. Who cleaned my suite? Nobody answered immediately. Rosa Martinez stepped forward. I supervised today's housekeeping. The guest threw a room key onto the table. My shirts weren't pressed correctly. And your staff dared to tell me the laundry schedule was full. I don't pay luxury prices to hear excuses. Several employees froze. They knew what would have happened months earlier. Old Luca would have exploded. Someone would have been fired before dessert. The investor turned toward Rosa again. Perhaps retirement would improve your performance. The restaurant became completely silent. Luca slowly walked across the room. He stopped beside Rosa. Not in front of her. Beside her. The difference mattered. He looked calmly at the guest. I'm sorry your expectations weren't met. The investor folded his arms. So you'll replace her? Luca gently shook his head. No. The man frowned. What? My employee followed company policy. We prioritize every guest equally. You requested a service after the final collection. The answer you received was correct. The investor's expression darkened. Do you know who I am? Luca smiled slightly. I do. And do you know how much business I bring this hotel? I do. The man leaned forward. Then perhaps you understand how this conversation ends. I do. Luca's voice remained calm. If respecting the people who work here is inconvenient for you, we'll gladly lose your business. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The investor stared at him in disbelief. You'd choose an employee over me? Luca answered without hesitation. I already have. The investor grabbed his briefcase and stormed towards the exit. The restaurant doors closed behind him. Silence lingered. Then, someone began clapping. Nobody knew who started. Within seconds, the entire restaurant applauded, not loudly, not theatrically, just long enough for every employee to understand one thing. This time, their leader had defended them. Rosa quietly wiped away a tear. You sound like your mother. Luca looked at her. I hope so. By evening, the conference concluded with record satisfaction scores. International partners extended their contracts. Several investors requested future events at the Valenti Crown Hotel. Financially, the conference exceeded every expectation. But Luca barely looked at the reports. For once, the numbers weren't the victory, the people were. The following afternoon, Maya prepared to leave. The mediation contract had officially ended. She loaded the final case files into her car. Before she could close the trunk, Luca approached. No bodyguards, no luxury car, no expensive gifts. Just himself. He held nothing except a quiet smile. Maya, she turned. I believe our contract has ended. It has, he nodded. Good. She waited. He took one slow breath, then asked, Would you have dinner with me? No business? No negotiations? No obligations? Just dinner. Maya folded her arms. She smiled. Is that an invitation? Or an instruction? Luca laughed. The sound came easily now. Definitely an invitation. She stepped closer. And if I say no, I'll thank you for your honesty. And if I say yes, I'll consider myself very fortunate. She looked into his eyes for several long seconds. The arrogance was gone. The certainty had softened into confidence. The fear had become humility. Finally, she smiled. I'd love to. 8 months later, the Valenti Group recorded the lowest employee turnover in company history. Customer satisfaction reached an all-time high. Applications to work at the hotel doubled. Profits increased despite reducing employee burnout. Business magazines praised Luca's leadership transformation. He accepted none of the personal credit. Whenever journalists asked what changed his company, he always gave the same answer. I finally started listening. Maya continued running Common Ground Resolution. She rejected every offer to join the Valenti Group. Luca never asked again. He respected her independence as much as he admired her. Before every major decision, one question now appeared at the top of every executive meeting agenda. What am I not seeing from their side? It became more than a question. It became the culture. One quiet afternoon, Luca pushed a housekeeping cart down the third-floor hallway. He volunteered for one front-line shift every month, not because anyone required it, because he never wanted to forget. A newly hired employee hurried around the corner carrying fresh linens. Without looking up, she said, "Excuse me, sir. Could you move your cart a little? You're blocking the hallway." Several security officers froze. A few long-time managers instinctively looked toward Luca. The new employee had no idea who she was speaking to. Luca immediately smiled. "Of course." He rolled the cart aside. "Thank you for pointing it out." The young employee smiled back. "Thanks." She continued working without another thought. Across the corridor, Maya had witnessed everything. She walked toward him slowly. Luca noticed her smile. Was that the correct answer? She pretended to think. No. He looked surprised. No? She reached for his hand. That wasn't the correct answer. It was simply the man I fell in love with. Then she kissed him. Not because he had become more powerful, but because he no longer needed power to prove his worth. Luca Valenti once believed that great leaders were the people everyone feared disappointing. Maya Ellis taught him something far more valuable. The greatest leaders are the people everyone feels safe enough to tell the truth.